fans, to another discussion and information video. We will be covering a range of topics from Retro Studios updates, Metroid Prime 4, and Metroid Dread. The release of Metroid Dread is only a little over a week away, and the excitement for that game is at an all-time high, and of course, following the release of Metroid Dread, it is going to be a clear path from that point forward to the release of a possible Metroid Prime Trilogy and Metroid Prime 4 from Retro Studios. Now, before we get into the main information about Metroid Dread's real connection to Metroid Prime 4, we need to discuss what is going on with Retro Studios, because it is very well likely that Retro Studios is working on 3 different releases. One, of course, being Metroid Prime 4, and the other, as we've been discussing, Metroid Prime Trilogy, but also another new game as well appears to be in development. So with that in mind, in regards to Retro Studios, I know that there has been some talk going on with rumors regarding Metroid Prime Trilogy from various sources of info, both on Twitter and even from the various suspect in regards to rumors, that is, gaming forum Reset Era. So just to make things clear, a lot of that talk going around should be taken with heavy grains of salt. Game development with Retro Studios has been the great mystery of the last 7 years since Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze in 2014. But to keep you guys updated on what's going on, there is a rumor of a Metroid Prime 1 remake happening with Retro Studios, and there is another rumor from a user at Reset Era that tried to connect that rumor with it actually being Metroid Prime Trilogy that is getting remade, possibly outsourcing the work Retro Studios did on Metroid Prime 1 remake to another developer to work on Prime 2 and Prime 3. Just basically a graphics remake of the trilogy with the same gameplay. Now, of course, fans of Metroid Prime Trilogy, myself included, will no doubt want a full remake of that trilogy with brand new graphics, and in combination with that though, it does make very little sense to just release Metroid Prime 1 on the Switch as a remake and not the entire trilogy before Prime 4 comes out. But as we know with all things Nintendo, they sometimes do the most baffling and confusing things in regards to gaming releases. Keeping all that in mind, however, followers of this channel since at least 2017, or when Metroid Prime 4 was first rumored and then announced, will know that on this channel here, we've been discussing the distinct possibility of Metroid Prime Trilogy getting a remaster with revamped graphics ever since Metroid Prime 4 was announced. And in turn, with what Retro Studios has been working on with their engine technology, if we recall back in 2019, we found that they were working with tools related to both CryEngine and Unreal Engine, hiring developer after developer after developer for mainly next generation graphics technology. We also were able to conclude that Retro Studios actually started working on Metroid Prime 4 very likely as far back as late 2018, with Nintendo only confirming it at the start of the year in January 2019. So while even though this rumor of Retro Studios revamping the original trilogy graphically may seem new, this is actually something we've been talking about consistently for nearly the past 3 years. Now, to formulate a theory on what Retro Studios is likely doing with all of this, and then if you would like to, you can then formulate that theory in connection with these rumors, but that's up to you, of course. But if we do that, it can all start to make more sense. However, in my opinion, those rumors aren't actually as relevant as one might think based on the information we've seen. And here's where it gets interesting. Back in March of 2018, nearly a full year before Retro Studios was announced to take over the development for Metroid Prime 4, Retro Studios was working on what appeared to be some kind of character-based, story-driven AAA game. And yes, we actually did cover that here on this channel back then, and I think a lot of people actually forgot about this. So to refresh your memory, let's take a very brief look at that video from March 2018 from this channel about Retro Studios and this game. For Retro. And it goes on to talk about, in further clarification, it says narrative specializations in world building, character development, design integration, non-linear storytelling, and prose fiction. So this looks like a very big project they're working on, and this particular developer, this writer, is helping to create this world for this new game being made by Retro. It sounds like a very narrative heavy, character driven based game, most likely a single player focused game, you know, with the non-linear storytelling and all these things encompassing it. It looks like, since it's a non-linear story, that it could very well be an open world game that has random exploration for the player and has this character driven story. So when you think about games like that, I think about Uncharted, I think about Horizon Zero Dawn, games that are very narrative
single-player focused, story-driven games, basically the types of games that you're seeing on PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, these next-generation type of games. So for this particular game, you can basically put to rest that this is a platformer game like Donkey Kong Country, right? So I don't think this is going to have anything to do with Donkey Kong, which is good news for those who are tired of seeing Donkey Kong on Nintendo platforms for the last few games that Retro has been working on. So no, this particular game does not appear to be Donkey Kong. They may be working on another platformer, who knows? You know, Retro Studios has been quiet for a very long time. They could be working on multiple projects, but for this particular project, it does look like a very heavy narrative-driven experience.
So the reason why I'm bringing this up again now in 2021 is because, as we covered back in one of the last Metroid Prime 4 update videos, it appears that Retro Studios started working on a new game, and with that they were hiring a concept artist and an environment designer, both for a 3D action adventure game, which, like we said, obviously wasn't Metroid Prime 4, because that game appears to be in the final testing pre-alpha to beta stages even at this point, as we revealed last year on this channel. Also, however, during this time, Retro Studios was hiring a storyboard artist, which has since been removed from their job page, and they currently only are still hiring for the same concept artist and environment designer. Yet despite that, on their job page, on their LinkedIn profile, they currently say they are not hiring for any new jobs at this point. So that's very interesting. Now, there are a few things we can connect with this with Retro Studios. We can conclude that this is both not Metroid Prime 4 or Metroid Prime Trilogy, but quite possibly this is Retro going back to work on that AAA character-driven game they started back in 2018, since it seemed like they had a very strong plan for this big game before they got tasked by Nintendo with developing Metroid Prime 4. Yet now, with Metroid Prime 4 looking like it has all the pieces in place in terms of developers working on it, and it's nearing its final stages, now they can start working more fully on this new game, possibly even a new IP. So you may be asking though, what about Metroid Prime Trilogy? Well, this is where some of those rumors of Metroid Prime Trilogy development start to make more sense, but also, by simply using some logic, we can likely figure out what Retro Studios already has ready and been preparing for the last 7 years since the end of their development of Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze on the Wii U. And back in February 2013, after Nintendo revealed Tropical Freeze, the UK official Nintendo magazine had an interview with Shigeru Miyamoto asking about the possible chance of Retro Studios working on the next Metroid or Metroid Prime to return to the series next, and I'm going to quote Miyamoto. He said, "Retro is a very high priority in terms of the potential team that would be considered for working on a Metroid game." And then, sure enough, in the years from 2014 all the way to the announcement of Metroid Prime 4 in June 2017, Retro Studios is very busy hiring developers working on yet another high-profile game. So during all that time, it appears Retro Studios has been testing their engines on various projects, and very likely one of them was or is a revamp of Metroid Prime Trilogy, since we know at first Nintendo said that Retro Studios wasn't going to work on Metroid Prime 4 when they announced it in 2017, so during that time they were likely asked to remaster the original Metroid Prime Trilogy, and then from 2017 through 2019 or so, they were likely getting a build of at least Metroid Prime 1 up and running on their new engine, which looks like it could be some kind of custom form of Unreal Engine from all the tech they've been hiring for during the last few years, and then in turn, this new engine could also serve as the foundation for Metroid Prime 4's engine. We also have to consider the possibility that as far back as 2013, Retro Studios could have had an early stages plan of a new Metroid Prime game after finishing development on Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, based on Miyamoto's words regarding Retro and the future of Metroid back then. So now, let's formulate a theory of what is going on with Retro Studios here based on all this information and try to put it all together so it's easy to understand. Here's what I think we may see from Retro Studios starting likely in 2022. I think we'll see the return of Retro Studios with a revamped version of Metroid Prime Trilogy, likely revealed as a long-time project they've been working off and on with for the last 5 to 6 years. We will then also see the first trailer for Metroid Prime 4 based on the same engine they've been developing in conjunction with Metroid Prime Trilogy. And then finally, we may see a small teaser for a brand new IP or a new game separate completely from Metroid and Metroid Prime that might end up being Retro Studios' version of like an Uncharted or Tomb Raider type of game, something heavy on story and character development but action-packed. But it does seem like they started work on this game back in 2018 and the game was halted, and now it's starting up again in 2021 as we noticed. So when it's all said and done, I think we will be getting 3 separate releases from Retro Studios between 2022 and 2025 time range. And 2 of those releases being brand new games, with one of them being Metroid Prime 4 and the other being this new character-based action game, and a remastered release with enhanced graphics running on a new engine with Metroid Prime Trilogy. And yes, just in case you're wondering, I do think these will all target the next generation Switch, or Super Switch if you will, but that's not to say that they won't also have a Switch OG version to go along with that. But perhaps these will be ported by another in-house studio. We'll have to wait and see. So I do think things are really going to start heating up with Retro Studios starting in 2022. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens. For the present time though, we have a huge release coming in just over a week with Metroid Dread, and there is a real connection here with Metroid Dread to Metroid Prime 4 that we're going to discuss. As we know, the Metroid series has seemingly been on the brink of possibly disappearing after its last few releases have sold not too well, with Metroid Prime Federation Force on the 3DS and Metroid Samus Returns also on the 3DS. Each of those games sold less than 1 million copies, and Samus Returns sold around 500,000 copies. So not really encouraging numbers for the series or for Nintendo to keep pushing Metroid on the Switch. Of course, until now with Metroid Dread. And as we know, since Metroid Prime 4 was announced in June 2017 for the Switch and got restarted development in 2019 with Retro Studios, and ever since then we've been looking for any kinds of updates possible on Metroid Prime 4 to get a hint of when we could possibly see it revealed. However, the Nintendo Switch, even though it sold very well, likely over 90 million at this point, a game like Metroid Prime 4 wouldn't necessarily be a sure thing for it to sell amazingly well for Metroid at this point in the Switch's lifespan. Now, while I understand that the quote-unquote Switch effect is a very real thing for first-party games on the Switch, it's also a console that has an audience that gravitates to very specific types of games. And while you have first-person shooters on the Switch like Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, which have sold pretty well in the system, the genre of first-person shooters and even first-person adventures like a Metroid Prime is not something that the console has much of to offer. However, what the Switch does have a lot of that its audience has come to expect are, yes, you guessed it, Metroidvania type games. In fact, these types of games from indie developers like Hollow Knight and Bloodstained, for example, have sold the best on the Switch out of all platforms in gaming, and they aren't even first-party Nintendo games or AAA third-party. So going back to Nintendo's thought process on Metroid Prime 4 and Metroid's future, no doubt this has all played a part in why Nintendo is releasing Metroid Dread right now on the Switch, and even though Metroid Prime 4 does in fact appear like it's ready to show, they aren't showing it just yet because maybe, just maybe, Nintendo sees a bigger opportunity to push Metroid itself as an IP into the spotlight. Metroid Dread will be introducing many new players that have never played a Metroid game before to Metroid for the very first time, and Nintendo as a business no doubt has been looking at ways to make sure Metroid Prime 4 is as successful as possible, and they probably could see that they had a lot of work to do in showing Switch owners what Metroid even was in the first place since announcing Metroid Dread at E3 2021. Nintendo doesn't feel like they can just release Metroid Prime 4. They also don't feel like they can just release Metroid Prime Trilogy either and think that that is enough to get people into Metroid again. We have to remember as well that even though a lot of core gamers really do prefer the Metroid Prime series over the mainline 2D Metroid games, the Metroid Prime series itself is not the mainline Metroid series. It's actually a spin-off series, and the same applies to Metroid Other M. That's another spin-off game. So it may sound crazy to think about when you really focus on it and examine all the things that Metroid is. It truly is the 2D games that are the mainline focus of the series, which is why Metroid Dread is of utmost importance for the Metroid franchise to be treated as a AAA release and for it to sell big numbers on the Switch, since if it does, which it appears it will, This will open up the floodgates yet again for the entire Metroid universe and for Metroid Prime 4 to be on the minds of Nintendo console owners yet again, and thus helping Metroid Prime 4 and the re-release of Metroid Prime Trilogy to have the opportunity to sell far more than they would have if they were just released without targeting an audience that plays more of a certain type of genre than first-person games on the Switch. And you may be thinking, yeah, but the Metroid Prime series is all in first person. How would Metroid Dread help those games sell in the future since they are so different from the mainline 2D offerings? Well, remember one thing though. Perspective in games isn't always the reason why something sells, more so than another. It's also name recognition. A great example of this is Zelda and Mario. Mario 64 made the move to 3D as a mainline Mario game as an evolution of the series, and so did Zelda with Ocarina of Time. And their brand recognition allowed them to be noticed by a large amount of gamers looking for something new in those franchises. The same applies also to Metroid with Metroid Prime. However, even back then in 2002, Nintendo had not had a new Metroid game in 8 years, from 1994 to that time in 2002. And Metroid Prime 1 was treated almost like a different series completely, since it's not a main game and it's also being played in first person. Yet it still sold over 2 million on the GameCube and was considered a success. Yet even then, it was definitely a different situation versus a Mario or Zelda, who totally moved to 3D from 2D for the mainline games. So for Metroid Dread, this is a way for Nintendo to connect the dots, so to speak, for the Metroid franchise and blow the old Metroid games out of the water in terms of sales figures, and give the series a new beginning, and then connecting it to the future success of Metroid Prime 4 and Metroid Prime Trilogy to make their grand return to AAA gaming. And who knows, maybe Metroid 6 or another mainline Metroid game will take Samus to full 3D in a third person's perspective, and then the Metroid Prime series and the mainline Metroid series will be that much closer in terms of audience and how the games look. And wouldn't it be amazing as well if Retro Studios was the one who develops a mainline series Metroid game in the future? I think that could actually happen if development and the success of Metroid blows up after the release of Metroid Dread. The future for Metroid is so very exciting, and we are only just at the beginning of it as well. And this is a new beginning. So the question is, will you be ready for Metroid domination?